And I would go so far as to say that the world has become toxic in many ways, and it's not just that one thing is, out of place or awry. It's that, the accumulation of all the various factors, whether we're talking about the toxic food supply. That's now just, overrun with ultra-processed foods, refined grain products, and industrial Gordon seed oils, but it's also there. Fact that chronic stress is rampant, most of us are not. Many of us should say they're not getting adequate sleep in a leisure time. Physical activity is at an all-time low. So it's the accumulation of all of these many factors, and I think overwhelm the body's defenses and predisposing us all to, our best memories, but at worst sickness and shortened lifespans. So, actually when I began writing The Junior's Life, which I started writing about 6 months after Genius Foods came out, I mentioned that my mother had a form of dementia, which was very heartbreaking. But what I never would have expected occurred on in labor. Dear 2018. My mum is actually diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And by the time it was diagnosed, which is often the case with pancreatic cancer, it was there was already evidence that it had spread. So it was already in stage 4, and they gave her a 3 to 6 month window. And it was 3 months almost to the day that she was diagnosed at time of has to write, and it was, just horrible and painful, and traumatic and barbaric, and it really. So, the fact that this happened during the time to retire with the book really caused me to kind of, look at the world in a new way, what were the factors at play for my mum's awful health in others? She developed, not one but 2 of humanity's most feared conditions, and those are all the kind of questions that I posit and explore ultimately in The Genius Life. Everything from a relationship with literature to light stress, to sleep to food, and only that's more about sort of health and longevity. On a more broader scale. I think the Ingenious Ways, which was really kind of focused on dementia prevention. I'm on the same page with you about the contribution of non-voluntary lifestyle factors. As I do this work, it's been over a decade now, and I think especially with the population of patients I work with, and maybe the people you interact with, a lot of them already thinking about nutrition. They're doing a pretty good job with their diet. It might not be perfect, but they're at least 80% of the way there. But they might not be. There might be kind of a basket case when it comes to sleep or stress management or toxic burden exposure. And you have number of things that you and I both talked a lot about. So I think those are often the elephant in the room when it comes to health optimization, or even preventing and reversing chronic disease. So, with that in mind, let's dive into specifics that you discuss in your book. Starting with light exposure, and this is something that my listeners heard me talk a lot about, but why don't you share a little bit about your research on the effects of light on the brain and body? And then what their kind of easiest, most practical solution to that is for folks. Yeah? So I think this is a really exciting area for science, and the story is we're just in the first chapter of what is being called Circadian Biology, which is basically how our body responds to cues in our environment. That let our genes know what time of day it is and are far the most potent. I'm sent to that our bodies use to gauge the time of day and to then accordingly set off its very many processes that it will undergo through a course of the day is light. And so as a master time center, I think the impetus is on us to make sure that we are getting good, It doesn't even have to be that, but I'll explain shortly. Light into our eyeballs, sometime in the morning. Ideally, soon after waking up, but generally that light is going to anchor your body's internal clock, which affect everything from your ability to feel energized, to focus, to pay attention, to be at your cognitive best. It affects physical performance. We know that, for example, strength is something that is influenced by our circadian rhythms. It affects digestion, where your digestion at your best peristalsis is at its most revved up during the day. I mean, we're diurnal creatures were meant to eat during the plain as when digestion is, our digestive mechanisms are firing on all cylinders. It affects metabolism. We know that we are primed to utilize and partition fuels during their day where are most insulin sensitive during the day. And, the inverse of that insulin resistance is the hallmark of type 2 diabetes, which many people struggle with, but then also, we are circadian. That circadian influence affects the latter half of the day, as well. So it dictates when the sleep hormone melatonin is going to begin to be secreted by the pineal gland, and melatonin is a lot of us think of it purely in that context to help us get to sleep. But actually, melatonin is a gatekeeper home and involved in autophagy, which is where our cells clean house. And it's, that's important for longevity. It's important for cancer prevention. And, this creation of Mount Vernon is as dictated in many ways by our circadian rhythms. So the way that works is we have this small group of light-sensing proteins and the I called non-obscene proteins. And I actually had the privilege to go and interview Session Panda down at the Salk Institute, who's on the team, who discovered these proteins, and these proteins are fairly insensitive and they're not involved in vision. And their insensitivity is it's a purposeful insensitivity, because if it were so sensitive, of that, a candlelight would set these proteins off. Then, our circadian clocks would be distinct from really low level, right? Thankfully, they're only really sensitive to it. Seems like that is at an intensity of about 1000 walks for higher, which you can easily attain by just exposing your eyes to just move your light. You don't have to be in direct sun. It doesn't even have to be all at sending out. You can be a fully over. First day, I got a lot of questions from people living in the north, during the winter. How do they do this when the sun is blocked out most of the day? Well, it can be overcast and I are still getting a white at an intensity that is going to anchor your body's circadian rhythm. And what happens then is that those proteins then speak to a small region inside of the hypothalamus called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is, your listeners don't have to remember that.